morning again, and thank you for being here and for joining us online. I've been going through a series of sermons looking at the life of Daniel. And Daniel was a man who stood on his faith in the midst of tremendous pressure to be different. The culture around him was constantly challenging him to be different than who God had called him to be. And we're going to see that again this morning. Although this morning, we're not really looking at Daniel. We're looking at his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we're going to see how God, how he rescued them as they stood against culture. You guys familiar with Build-A-Bear? You know what Build-A-Bear is? If I'm talking about Build-A-Bear. I didn't raise daughters in my household, so Build-A-Bear wasn't a high priority, but we have walked past it in the mall a couple of times, and Cherry and I have gone in and just checked it out, and I find Build-A-Bear to be kind of an interesting concept. You know what you do. You go in, and they have these little bears, and you get to stuff the bear, and then you get to choose what kind of bear it's going to be. It could be a police bear, a fireman bear, school teacher bear, Trump bear. I've seen those. You've seen, you get to build your bear, and you decide how you're going to express yourself through the bear. And it's quite cute. It is. It's cute. But here's the thing. Here's what I think happens to us sometimes when it comes to our walk with the Lord and our faith in Him. I think sometimes we think we can build our faith like we build a bear. And so what I mean by that is that we think this is my life, and this is how I'm going to express my faith in my life. And we can do it in all kinds of ways. None of them may necessarily be bad any more than a police bear is worse than a school teacher bear. Neither one is bad. We're just choosing how we want to express ourselves. And so in our faith, sometimes we think this is me, this is what I believe, this is how I'm going to express my faith to my family, to my friends, to my neighborhood, at work, at school, in retirement. This is how I'm going to express my faith. I'm going to build my faith and express it how I want to express it. The only problem with that is that God many times has a different plan for our life. And we don't really always get to choose how we're going to express our faith. What happens is we are faced with a choice, and we will either be faithful or not faithful in that choice. And what we do in that choice, that expresses our faith to the people around us. And we would have never put ourselves in the position to be in that choice. Does that make sense? But God put us there because He wants our faith to be expressed in such a way that He is seen, not that we are seen. Okay? And so that's what's going on in this passage. This idea of how does God want us to express our faith in our lives. And so I want us to start off talking about what I'm just calling the greatest conflict in life. And we'll get to that conflict in just a moment. But in Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, we pick up the story of Daniel and his friends. And you'll see this morning, Daniel's not mentioned at all. This is all about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It starts off in verse 1. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So I want to stop right here and kind of catch us up to what's going on. If you heard last week's sermon, you know what happened there. But what takes place in Scripture sometimes that you and I forget is that as we're reading through the Bible, it seems to be moving quick when in real time, when the people that were really alive, a lot of time has passed. And so Bible scholars believe that there's about 20 years between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. So that's kind of important for us to remember, because if you just read the first 6 chapters of Daniel, it's like boom, 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 boom. God is having to move in a miraculous way all the time in these guys' lives, when in reality, it's an entire lifetime. And they've condensed these great movements of God into 6 chapters, even though it was 80 years of time. And the reason I bring that up is because God, thank goodness, we don't need a miracle every day. Because there's a lot of strain and stress that comes with getting a miracle from God. And thankfully, God just calls us to routine faithfulness, which can be hard in and of itself. But there are moments that happen in life where we find ourselves in situations where I would never choose to be in that situation. And now I've got to make a stand one way or the other. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego find themselves in one of these situations when King Nebuchadnezzar built this golden image. Now, it says that he summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So we're told that 8 levels of government are expected to show up on the plain of Dura. So it's not everyone in the entire Babylonian kingdom, okay? Because that spanned a massive amount of area. So what the king has done is he calls in these 8 levels of government that represent all the other people in the empire. So it would be like us calling together our Senate and our representatives. They represent the rest of us, right? And so they're there on representation of the people that they're set up over. And he's called them together to well, we're going to see in just a moment, to bow down to this golden image. Now, why would he do this? Why would King Nebuchadnezzar all of a sudden say, I want everyone to bow down this image of gold? There's a couple of things going on, but the most practical thing that was happening is simply this. He's trying to bring unity to his empire. The Babylonian Empire grew really fast. It overran other empires really quickly. So his empire, this Babylonian Empire, is full of different ethnicities, different religions, and there's this unity because everybody's different. And so he's trying to fix that. So what he's going to do is he's going to say, you know what? I'm going to give everybody one religion. I'm not going to tell them that they can't have their little r religions. They can have their little r religions. But what I'm going to do is set up an establishment, set up my empire in such a way that I am their top loyalty, that I am who they serve. That as long as their little r religions don't conflict with what I want, they can do that all they want to. But when there comes a conflict between what Nebuchadnezzar wants and what their faith or their desires or their preferences want, they know they're to lay down their preferences, lay down their convictions, and do what King Neb wants. That's the practical side behind everything that's happening here. He's trying to develop unity. I'm not saying he's doing a good thing of doing it. I'm just saying that's what's going on. And so look at what happens next. It says, so all the officials assembled for the dedication of the image of that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So I want to point out some things so you get what's going on, okay? In his effort to create unity in his kingdom, he has established himself as the authority, the rule, the God. You can hang on to all your other little stuff if you want to. But when what I want and what you want come into conflict, you must bow to me. That's what he set up. And the word that keeps coming up over and over and over again in Daniel chapter 3 is the word worship. It's used 11 times in this chapter. And worship, it literally means to prostrate oneself or to do homage, to show devotion. That's what the word literally means. And so it means that all of us must decide who we worship. Who's our loyalty to? Who are we devoted to? Who do we pay homage to? Who do we bow down to? In other words, who do we submit our life to? That's what's going on. And King Nebuchadnezzar is saying, I want this entire empire to submit their life to me. I am who they're going to be loyal to above everyone else. Now, worship is something that we decide in our minds and in our hearts, but the way that it fleshes itself out is by who we serve. If you want to know what you worship, look at what you serve. And what I mean by that is that when there's a conflict in your life between two priorities, you have priority A and priority B, and they're both important in your life. But when they conflict with each other and they begin to rub up against each other and you can't do both, the one you serve is the one you worship. Does that make sense? That's what's happening in this passage. He's saying to everyone in the Babylonian Empire, I'm priority A. You can have other priorities, but when there's a conflict, you lay that down and your loyalty is with me. Worship, serve me above everything else. That's what he's laying down. And that leads us to the question, the greatest conflict that all of us have in life, and that is, who will we serve when the expectations of culture conflict with obedience to Jesus Christ? Who will we serve? Is following Jesus really priority A in our life? We have several cultures that we live in. We have the American culture, we have our political cultures, we have our family cultures, we have cultures in our age groups, or we have a culture in our workplace, we have a culture in our career. And so when you're bebopping along in one of those subcultures that we all must live and function in, and then all of a sudden the demand of that culture is now rubbing up against the demand of what it means to follow Jesus, which one will we serve? Where's our loyalty? What do we really worship? That's the greatest conflict we have in life. Because, you see, what we want to do is the Build-A-Bear faith, you know? I build my faith and express it like I want to. Until there's this conflict between what God wants and what the culture wants and the expectations they have upon us. And so, again, one of the... I remember at another place at another time, there was a student in our youth group in the church that I was pastoring that he truly felt like the Lord was calling him into ministry, calling him into a profession of ministry. And he shared that with his parents, and his parents were absolutely, they saw that as a waste of his skills and of his abilities, and they simply... that was just not the expectation they had on his life. And he had to choose. Am I going to do what I feel God is leading me to do, or am I going to yield to the expectations of my parents? Who did he really worship? I've met people in my time of being a pastor who they're in their career, they're in the prime of their career, they're doing it exactly like they're expected to do it, until all of a sudden what their career field expects them to do and what God is asking them to do come into conflict with one another. And what will they do? Who will they serve in that moment? That is our greatest conflict. And that's what's happening to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Bible goes on to tell us, beginning in verse 8, and what I want you to notice as we read forward here into this passage, notice how silent God is. Notice what's happening. So in verse 8, it says, at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Is it true you're not loyal to me? That's what he's really asking. That's what he's really saying. He's saying, look, guys, I'm trying to develop unity in the kingdom here. I need to know that when there's a conflict between what you want and what I want, that you know who you really serve. That's what he's saying. Now, when you hear the sound of music, he says to them, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So he gives them a second chance. I mean, they already failed in front of everyone, so now he's pulled them aside and he says, look, guys, I'm going to give you another chance to do this. And notice their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. That's kind of a bold statement, isn't it? If we go back to Daniel chapter 2 last week, these three guys, along with Daniel, already have a history with King Nebuchadnezzar. He knows who they are. These aren't just three random men who refused to do what he was asking people to do. No, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego helped the king understand when God gave him a dream in chapter 2. So he knows exactly who they are. And that's why they say to him what they say. Hey, king, come on, king, we have history with you. We're not going to defend ourselves to you about this. You know who we are. You know who we are. I think the reason that the king gives them another chance is because he likes them. They helped him in the past. He has no desire to harm them. But at the same time, guys, when it boils down to it, I need to know you stand with me over your God. That's what he's saying. They go on to say to him, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Notice this next phrase because I think it's key to what goes on. Look at what the Bible says next. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. See, prior to this, he's like, come on, guys, I'm giving you a chance. Come on, can't you just cooperate with me here in what I got going on? I know you believe in God. I know you got your convictions. I know you got your values. But can you just bend a little bit and meet me in the middle? And they're like, no, sorry, we can't. So now his attitude changes. Now he was furious. Now he's furious with an attitude change. Okay? That's what the Bible is saying. And so his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. You know, just in case your God can't save you from a normal heated furnace, we're going to heat it up 7 times hotter than. This is an image of his anger towards them because he cannot understand. It's like he's looking at them and saying, guys, you've helped me in the past. In the past, you came through for me. Now I need your help again, and you won't help me. That's what's going on. He commanded the strongest soldiers in an army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. So when we think about this blazing furnace thing, it had windows in it. You're going to see that in just a moment. But if you can imagine, it's kind of like a tower. It's not a huge, tall tower, but a tower big enough, maybe 40, 50 feet in diameter. And they used these furnaces. They would get them real hot to melt metal and things of that nature. And so that's what they are thrown into. They're taken into and tossed into the furnace. And the guys who tossed them in, it was so hot it killed them as they tossed them into that furnace. Now my question to you is, where's God in all this? Because he hasn't said anything. He hasn't swooped in and changed their circumstance. He didn't change the heart of the king. Where is God in all of this? Many times when you and I are being tested in our faith, when we're being tested in this idea of, am I going to serve God in this choice, or am I going to serve the other priority? Or the other expectation that's come into conflict with remaining loyal to Christ? Which one am I? In those moments, many times, God is silent. He's silent. And it leads us to this first point, and that is that God allows the faithful to be called out and mistreated. He allows this to happen. What kind of God do we serve? I mean, come on. That we don't think about it this way. In fact, we think just the opposite. We think if I will be faithful, if I will follow the Lord, He will protect me. He will watch over me. He will give me, soft pillows and plenty of candy corn. I mean, He's gonna take care of me. But yet, what we discover over and over and over again in the Scriptures is that people who are truly faithful to the Lord are always called out for it, and many times mistreated for it. Are you guys familiar with the term of a crossover song? So used to be, I'm not aware of one recently that has happened, but a lot of times there would be like a Christian band or a Christian singing group, and and they sing to Christians. That their music is for Christians, okay? But then they write a song that everybody likes. Even non-Christians like that song. And that song is what they call a crossover song. It leaves the Christian charts and moves into the secular music charts. And it becomes a crossover. And if a group does enough of these songs where they have these crossover songs, well, then all of a sudden their identity is a crossover. Because they were a faith-based Christian group, but now they're putting out songs that everybody likes, even non-Christian people like. And a lot of times when that happens, these groups, they fall under scrutiny. Because the way you operate in the Christian music industry is not necessarily the same way you operate in the secular music industry. And so they get called out for things. Did they choose that? Or did they just write a song? And people liked it. And so what happens to you and I is that as we are living for the Lord, as we're trying to be faithful to the Lord, many times what happens, we're just being faithful. We're just being ourselves. And all of a sudden, we cross over. And now our convictions, our faith, our principles are not in our little Christian bubble where everybody agrees with us. Where everybody says, oh yeah, why wouldn't you act that way? All of a sudden, our faith has crossed us over into the secular, and now there's a conflict. Will you and I remain loyal, serve, worship the Lord when that happens? And when it does, I can tell you, when we find ourselves in the throes of those decisions, God is largely silent. He doesn't say a whole lot. When this happens, it leads us to the second point. And that is that you and I must trust God no matter what. When we find our faith crossing us over, whether that conflict be with family expectations or our school expectations, career expectations, wherever we find that crossover. And now then we must choose between, am I going to follow Jesus and remain faithful to Him and worship Him, or are my loyalties really somewhere else? And God's being quiet. God doesn't appear to be moving on our behalf. God doesn't appear to be taking the choice away. No, that's why it's there. And in that moment, you and I must trust God no matter what. Listen, these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were men by now. They were men. And they had to decide. Listen, they could have come up with all kinds of compromises to appease the king. They could have looked at what was going on and said, well, my gosh, everybody else did it. I mean, there were 8 levels of government called in. Every other level of government did this. We can bow down, but we know what's really going on in our hearts. Isn't that a favorite that we use sometimes? They could have looked at it and said, but it's my job, it's my livelihood, it's my life, literally. Literally, how can God use me if I'm ash? Wouldn't it be better if I, incognito, under the radar Christian? At least I could be alive. Lord, what good am I to you dead? I mean, they could have said that. They could have thought, we can do way more good for the causes of God by staying alive. I mean, obviously, there's not very many Christians in the 8 levels of government. So surely we can do more good by being, God needs us here. They could have made all of those compromises. And the truth is that many of us would look at them and say, yeah, boy, I understand. I understand. Our faith, it rests on commands and promises. It does not rest on explanations. God is not required to give us any explanations. That's why the Bible is filled with such mystery sometimes. All kinds of things that we read in the Scripture that we must take by faith because He's not going to give us an explanation. And so we must believe Him at His word. We must trust His promises that He has made to us. And that's what we find these 3 men doing. They're not asking God for an explanation as to why they are, or what God is trying to do, or what He's trying to prove through them. They just say, you know what, God, we trust you no matter what. That's what they said to the king. We will not bow down to you. Our God will rescue you, will rescue us, and even if He doesn't, we still trust Him alone. That's what they said. Trust God no matter what. I read a story about an Indian chief in Canada. His name was Crowfoot. He was chief of the Siksika Indian tribe. I have no idea where they're from, what part of Canada they're in, or anything like that. But the story goes that when Canada was building its Pacific Railway, the railroad tracks needed to go across the Siksika Indian land. And so the government, the Canadian officials, they went to Crowfoot and they were trying to bargain with him to allow them to lay the train tracks on his land, on the tribe's land. And so to come to an agreement to figure out what they needed to do, the Canadian Pacific Railway made a promise to Chief Crowfoot. They said, you can ride on our train for free for life. And they put it in a document. And they wrote it up. It's a very pretty document. They wrote it up and they put it inside a case. And they put it inside this wooden case. And the story goes that he wore that around his neck for the rest of his life. That he had this promise from the Canadian Pacific Railway that any point, at any time, he could get on the train and ride anywhere. But here's the thing. There's no record of him ever getting on a train. Even though he had the promise, there was no record of it. And I think that's what happens to you and I, is we have all these promises from God. We do our Bible studies, we read our devotions, we sing our songs, and they're full of promises. They're full of promises from God. And we wear them around our neck. In fact, we wear them on t-shirts. We wear them on our hats. We post them on our social media. We have all these promises from God. But we're reluctant to lean on them. We're reluctant to stand on them and truly remain loyal to the Lord when conflicts of interest come in our life between following Him and some other expectation. These men were not like that. They said, you know what? I don't know what's going on here. It doesn't look good. But we're going to trust God no matter what. Well, notice what happens as we continue to read the Bible. In verse 24, it says, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement. Why? Well, they just threw these guys into the fire, into the furnace. You know, they just thrown him in. And he leaps to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around the fire. unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like the Son of God's. And Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. I find that kind of funny because, they're just walking around inside the furnace. It's like, we got thrown in here, what do we do now? I don't know, let's just walk around. And so now he has to call on them to come back out. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the royal advisors crowded around them. And they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was the hair of their heads singed. Their bodies were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who can say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. This leads us to something that I want us to see a little bit this morning. And that is that until they were thrown into the fire, no one knew God was there. God has been silent. He's not said anything. He's not done anything to change the situation. It was not until they were thrown into the fire that everyone saw, oh, God is here. You see, God is present, but he cannot be seen without faith. It was not until they were in the fire that everyone saw that Jesus was there with them. And the same holds true for me and you. Listen, even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not know Jesus was there until they were in the fire. That's the first time they saw him, was when they went into the fire. And many times that's exactly what it feels like for me and for you. We find ourselves in the throe of something. We find ourselves in this conflict that says God has called me to be one way, and my family or my career or my spouse or my children or something is calling me to be different. And if I really do what God wants me to do, oh my gosh, it is going to be hell in my life. Guess what? Many times we don't meet Jesus till we go to hell on earth. And that's where he is. And he's with us the whole time. But we have to be willing to say, I trust God no matter what. Everyone there simply bowed, except these three guys. And they said, we won't. We won't. Listen, I love the fact that their words were few. They didn't argue with the king. They didn't debate with the king. They didn't try to get other people to stand with them. They didn't hold a political rally. They didn't start a hashtag movement. They just said, we are not going to do it. And when we look at the world around us, it's easy for us to see how the world around us gives up and how they just bow down. They just cave to all the expectations. But we can't be like that. And we have to trust that God rescues his people. Now listen to me very carefully. Please don't miss this. God rescued Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay? But not even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They did not presume God would do that. Faith is not presumption. Okay? And they didn't know Jesus was going to walk in the fire with them until they got into the fire. When they were being thrown into the fire, I'm pretty sure they were thinking, this is it, guys. But we trust God no matter what. And so listen, we can't presume that we're going to get a miracle. Sometimes we don't get a miracle. Sometimes we lose our job. because we did the right thing. Sometimes our family doesn't forgive us because we did the right thing. Sometimes we don't get the miracle. But God always rescues His people in one way or another. I was reading a little article about roller coasters the other day. I don't know why. I must have had some extra time on my hands. And this guy defined a roller coaster as this. He said, it throws you up in the air and then it throws you down to the ground. Then it spins you around in circles and it makes you feel like you're going to fall out. And just before you throw up, you get out and find out you haven't gone anywhere. Sometimes following Jesus is like riding a roller coaster. When you say, He has my loyalty, I am going to be loyal to Him above all other things. Sometimes, not every week, but sometimes in life, it's going to be like getting on a roller coaster. And following Him is going to throw you up in the air, and it's going to make you feel like you're going to slam into the ground, and it's going to disorient you. You're going to be all over the map, and you're going to think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to survive. I'm going to lose it all, only to discover at the very last minute, it comes to a stop, and you're right back where you started. And God got you through all of it. And He was there. Folks, you and I must learn to live our lives in such a way that sometimes God puts us on a roller coaster. And we just have to trust Him. No matter what, God, I will trust you. I will trust you. Listen, for those of you watching online this morning, our time together is done. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll come back and join us again next week.